Hey nerdy knitters, if you're a fan of Outlander, you're going to want to stick around. In today's video, we're going to look at some of my favorite hand knit garments just from season 2. This show is chock full of beautiful hand knit garments, and we've covered the historical accuracy, some of the great knits in season 1, and today we're going to look at season 2. Before we do, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer. My goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. And today we're going to have some fun looking at some great knitting patterns from Outlander. There's a lot going on with season 2 of this show. It opens with a cliffhanger. Claire is back in her own time, but we have no idea how she got there. But eventually we go back to her and Jamie, and they're off in France for the first half of the season. And then in the second half, they're back in Scotland, where we have lots of lovely hand knits. And then we have some episodes where we've got some things going on in the 1960s and some great hand knit garments from that time period as well. So there's lots to explore today. Now we have some hand knitting right away in the very first episode. When Claire has come back through the stones, she's still wearing clothes from the mid 18th century, and she's wearing those hand knit gauntlets or wrist warmers, and they have that beautiful cable design down the front. But if you really love these gauntlets, check out these cable knit wrist warmers with that big bulky cable running right down the back of the hand. And later on, right in the very first episode, we see Claire in a modern 1940s dress. She's got on a skirt and a white button-up blouse and a pretty cable vest with a very classic design. You can find this pattern in the book Outlander Knitting. It's called the Library Vest. So if you really like this classic design that Claire is wearing, then check out that pattern and that book. We're not done with episode 1 yet. We also have a beautiful Fair Isle vest that little Roger is wearing. That's an absolute classic Fair Isle stranded colorwork vest. And if you like that, then check out Freddie by Marie Wallin. Now this is a child size vest or sleeveless jumper, whatever the terminology you use for that. But if you're looking for something that's adult size, check out the Vementry vest by Mary Jane Mucklestone, which is also a beautiful stranded Fair Isle colorwork pattern. Now if you've done a bit of Fair Isle knitting, but you want to up your stranded colorwork Fair Isle knitting game, then check out the Craftsy class that includes this pattern. It walks you through everything, all of the techniques you'll need to know, from choosing your colors to working the pattern to working the steek stitches and cutting your knitting and finishing. It's all there. Now, after that very first episode with all of those lovely hand knits, we are back in time with Jamie and Claire in the mid 18th century. And for the first half of the season, they're in France. And there is not much going on for hand knitting here, but there are plenty of beautiful garments to look at. Now, I have no idea if any of these are historically accurate. I didn't look into that at all, but we can appreciate how beautiful these clothes are. This would have been a great place to include some hand knitting, because historically fingerless mitts and purses were often hand knit with silk or cotton or even wool. It was really thin yarn and very, very fine needles and stitch work. These would have been a beautiful thing to complement the show. And of course they didn't add it. That's okay. We still have all of those beautiful dresses to look at. But then we get to the second half of the season when they're back in Scotland and those beautiful hand knit garments are back. And when they're back in Scotland, Claire has returned to her famous Rent shawl from season 1. This is a super popular pattern with many, many knitters. You'll find it in both Outlander Knitting and Highland Knits. They are full of Outlander inspired patterns, and the Rent shawl is in both of those. And in episode 8, we see Fergus in an interesting garment. It looks like it's crocheted, which it's a bit early for crochet. I don't believe that came until later in the 1800s. There's a link down below that talks about some crochet history if you're interested in learning more about that. And they certainly didn't have bulky yarn like this for this type of project. That's something that they didn't have in the mid 18th century. There weren't the knitting needles for that type of yarn, and they didn't have really thick yarn like that. There's no evidence for it. I have a whole video just about the historical accuracy if you're interested in checking that out. But while we're discussing historical accuracy, I just want to show you this comment I got on that video. Bulky knits were not around back then, but neither was a nurse from the 1940s, so we could say this is an alternative reality where time travel is possible and other people from the future have traveled even further back in time and invented larger knitting needles before they existed in the timeline we are in. I'd love to know your thoughts. What do you think about the historical accuracy or just the garments in general in this show? Do you have a favorite that you'd love to knit? Why don't you tell me about it, and let's move on to the next one. Claire's shawl from episode 9. It looks like it's worked in garter stitch, and it's knit tip to tip, and it's got that pretty scalloped edge. And if you like that design, then look at this one, the Sensible Shawl by Celeste Young. While it's not an exact replica, it is worked tip to tip and it has that really pretty border added along it as well. Claire is also wearing some fingerless mitts in this episode. These would be very simple to knit on your own. They're just stockinette tube, add a little bit of texture at the top. But if you're looking for a pattern, there's a pattern from Handy Little Me, which has a lot of Outlander knits, and she has one for these as well, the Je Suis Prêt knits, which are just a simple stockinette tube with some textured ribbing at the top and bottom of each mitt. Claire is also wearing some more wrist warmers in episode 11, and these would be super simple to make. They are just reverse stockinette. So just knit a stockinette tube and let the edges curl, and then flip them so the wrong side's facing out, the reverse stockinette side, and you have your own arm warmers, DIY'd. Now at the end of the season, we are back in 1960s Scotland, and there is some fabulous knitwear in this last part of the show. In this shot, we can see Roger and Bree. He's wearing a cable turtleneck sweater, and she's wearing a cable knit scarf. What I found really interesting is that both garments use the same stitch pattern. Now, I don't know if that was an intention on the designer's part to show the relationship between these two characters, but I just thought it was neat that among all of the cable garments they could wear, they have the same exact stitch pattern in the garments they're wearing here. If you'd like to knit either one of these, there is a replica pattern on Ravelry for Brianna's Honeycomb scarf, and the Honeycomb Aran from Peyton's would be a good inspiration for Roger's sweater. Now, the last pattern we're going to look at is the yoke colorwork sweater that Bree wears. This absolutely fabulous sweater. It's just so beautiful. Now, if you really like Bree's colorwork yoke sweater, then take a look at the Randall Frazier sweater from the Outlander knitting book. This is a beautiful replica of that sweater pattern. Now, if you know you want to knit a few Outlander-inspired knitting patterns, then I highly suggest two different resources. The Outlander knitting book, it was edited by Kate Atherley, and it's the official Outlander book, and it has lots of beautiful patterns. Or the Highland Knits book from Interweave Press, which has lots of patterns that were inspired by the early seasons of the show as well. If you're looking for more Outlander-inspired knitting, then take a look at Season 1 right here.